Hello, I'm Paul Innes, Professor of Shakespeare Studies, and welcome to my channel Shakespeare for All. Today I'll be talking about Macbeth. This is one of 3 videos on the play dealing with characterisation, plot and context. In this episode I'll be talking about plot. At the end of the videos I offer some study tips for the play together with a list of keywords. I hope you find these useful if you have to write about the play. I use the 3rd Adrian edition for quotations, but any edition you use that has good supporting material is fine. And if you want to know more, please remember to subscribe. So, to start with, a little bit of context. It's 1606, Macbeth's about to be performed. James VI of Scotland has been on the throne of England for 3 years. He came to the throne in 1603 as the first king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Now, he was famous because he oversaw the destruction of a witch cult in Scotland while he was king there, and for writing about the evils of witchcraft and demonology. Obviously, the play refers to these events and also to the gunpowder plot of the year before, 1605. Also, according to legend, the characters Banquo and Fleance are the legendary ancestors of this King James. So that's the context. For a broad overview, we're going to look at the play as a whole. It's quite a short play, usually a couple of hours in performance, give or take, unlike Hamlet, for example, which can be up to twice as long, especially if you need a break or 2. We'll look at each act in turn, we'll look at the length of individual scenes, how the play moves between them, what happens, how it happens, and at what speed. That's important in this play. It's constant. This play has a momentum. Think of it almost like a movie. Macbeth is your main point of view character, Lady Macbeth is the main secondary character, almost taking over at points. There's the important subplot of Banquo, even though he doesn't do very much, he's there for a reason. And there are cut scenes to the witches, King Duncan's court, parts of Scotland during Macbeth's reign, the opposition and so on. So the slide that you'll see is pretty straightforward. It gives you a sense of the overall structure of the play. I've just given you the number of lines in each act. What you'll see is they don't vary that much, which means that the exposition, the plotting, the elements of plot that come to the fore in succession are done in a pretty constant manner. This is not a play that suddenly ends with a really short final act or has an enormously long first act. It's even throughout. Now, in Act 1, you have, as you can see, 7 scenes. We start with a scene that is only 10 lines long. This is very unusual, and it's the weird sisters, the witches. It's short and sweet and sharp. And this is where the plot begins. The plot is started not by the main character, but by the witches very quickly. We then move to the War Council of King Duncan, where he's receiving reports from the front. This is only 68 lines. This introduces something that's extremely central to the performance techniques of this play. Remember, it's a play. If you can get something about the fact there's a play in an assessment, it makes you look good. Many events in the play take place off stage. They're not directly shown. This is one of them. King Duncan is not leading his armies in person. He's not a warrior. Someone else is leading his armies, someone called Macbeth, who is a warrior. What does that mean? It means the king is not in charge of the army. That's going to be important for the development of the play. We then shift to the witches, meeting Macbeth and Banquo as they return from the battlefield, and they speak the prophecy about Macbeth becoming king and another prophecy about Banquo not becoming king but becoming the ancestor of kings, James VI, James I. And then Ross and Angus come in to conduct them to the court. The witches have vanished by this point. There's a very short scene next, Act 1, Scene 4, back at Duncan's court, King Duncan's court. Macbeth arrives, he's invested a Stane of Cawdor, and Malcolm, the king's elder son, is proclaimed and invested as heir to the throne, and Macbeth is not happy about this. King Duncan then decides to visit Inverness. Now, you see what I mean when I said earlier, things happen all the way through this play. This is a rapid succession of important events. This play doesn't give you time to breathe. Next scene, Lady Macbeth has received a letter from her husband saying he's coming home and the king's coming to visit, told her about the witches, and she immediately decides in soliloquy, I'm going to kill him. Now, soliloquy is important because it is a speech delivered directly to the audience by a member of the cast telling them what they're up to and what they think. It's like a super aside. King Duncan is on his way to this castle and he ain't going to leave. You then have a little short scene where King Duncan and the nobles arrive, and then another important scene from the point of view of the development of the plot, where Macbeth has decided not to proceed in the business, but Lady Macbeth changes his mind. The interaction between the two is very famous, and watch for that if you're studying the play. That's the first act. A lot happens. Moving on to Act 2, there are 4 scenes. The third one is medium length, the rest are quite short. And again, quite a few crucial elements happen, dotted relatively evenly through the exposition of the act. First scene, you have various things happening. The most important elements from the plot development is Macbeth's soliloquy just before he goes off to kill King Duncan. This is standard exam fodder, it's assessment fodder. If you can quote sections of that or refer to that, it should help you. It ends with a rhyming couplet. Now, we don't tend to spend so much time thinking or worrying about this kind of thing. It's a facet of the use of language. But again, this is an important thing to say. This is a useful thing to say in an exam or essay question and answer. If you can point to the fact that this is performance poetry, pick up on the language, it helps. The reason it's important is it's a little rhyme that signifies the end of a scene and a changeover. This is something that's audible for an English Renaissance audience. You then have Lady Macbeth in soliloquy, along with an important conversation with Macbeth when he returns from having killed King Duncan, again off stage. The murder is not shown. And what happens is she has a right go at him. She's not happy. She says, you didn't follow things through. We agreed at what you would do. You would leave the daggers with the guys that were going to blame for the murder, the king's attendants. You've still got them. What are you playing at? What are you doing, you stupid man? And she runs off and puts them by the attendants off stage. You also get something that resonates at this point in the play. You get an emblematic knocking on the gates of the castle, and the soon-to-be king and queen retire to their bedchambers. And this leads to the next scene, which is quite long, but it's divided into several shorter sections, which is what we call the emblematic porter scene. Emblematic knocking, emblematic porter. What does that mean? It means something that is not intrinsic to the plot, but which is symbolic of the plot. It comments on the plot. Obviously, you have a drunken Scotsman at the gates to what is now effectively hell, and you've got knocking on the gates. Is this the devil come knocking or whatever? So it refers to the symbolism of the darkness that's beginning to emerge in the play. Turns out that it's Macduff and Lennox who've arrived to waken the king, and this is when everyone finds out the guy's dead. At this point, watch for this in terms of the plot. Tiny little moment, but it's extremely significant. King Duncan's sons do a runner, right? They're not daft. They think they're going to be next. Malcolm is going to England and Donalbain is going off to Dublin. There's a reason for that. They're not stupid. They can see they're next, right? They don't trust the situation. You then move on to a very short scene at the end of the act, 41 lines, which is again emblematic, with a little old man talking about what's been going on and various signs in nature and all the rest of it. But also you have another one of those signifying moments of off-stage representation, because you don't actually see Macbeth being crowned, right? Why not? Because that would maybe give him some legitimacy. But the fact is, his investiture at Scone is going to happen off-stage. That's the first 2 acts already. Now moving on to Act 3, what happens when Macbeth is king? This is life in Macbeth, Scotland, it's not funny. You have a reasonably long scene to begin with. Short soliloquy by Banquo, worrying about how did Macbeth get the throne, what's going on here. He's off to do some hunting. Macbeth is worrying in soliloquy about Banquo because he knows from the witches that Banquo is going to become the ancestor of a line of kings. So Macbeth is manipulating the situation. Macbeth works through servants, he works through dodgy people. He's almost like a police state. He's got people running around behind the scenes killing folk for him, and that's what happens here. The servant brings in a couple of murderers, and the king, King Macbeth, says, I want you to kill this guy Banquo for reasons of state, basically. Now, quite a few modern performances do pick up on this and almost play Macbeth's Scotland as a sort of totalitarian state. There's good warrant for that in the text. You then move on to a short scene where there's another little plot moment, the conversation between King and Queen Macbeth. And he doesn't tell her that he's arranged for Banquo to be murdered. Why not? Because he doesn't feel the need for her support quite so much. Now that changes slightly in the next scene, which is when the news of the murder is delivered and you have the famous Banquo ghost in the banquet. Banquo in the banquet. Maybe that's deliberate. But what you have is a situation where Macbeth is unmanned by this. He's still not quite in control. And again, it has to be stressed that Banquo is important, not to the plot. He's crucial because he's the royal ancestor of the kings of Scotland, and his son Fleance escaped in the confusion when his father was killed. There's then a couple of other short scenes which we don't need to go into in any detail. They're on the screen for you. So moving on to Act 4. There are only 3 scenes in this act. The first one is medium length. This is Act 4, Scene 1, 155 lines. The witches are in council, for lack of a better term, gathered round their cauldron, bubbling things. And one of them says, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. And then comes Macbeth. She can sense him approaching. It's almost like Darth Vader or something. Plot hole. How does Macbeth know where they live? Okay, because he's only ever met them once, and that was on the heath, on the way back from the battlefield with Banquo, when they interrupted him. So how does he know where they are? The answer has to be symbolic. He knows where they are because he's one of them. He's a member of the dark side. And this scene is where the importance is the wrong word here, crucial set of second prophecies is spoken. Macbeth mistakenly believes from that he's going to be somehow invincible, and he also is reminded of the extreme centrality of Banquo as the ancestor of a line of future Scottish kings. You then shift to a short scene where Macduff's family is wiped out on Macbeth's orders, and then there's a really central is not the right word. It's crucial to the plot development. It's a strange scene from our point of view. It's Act 4, Scene 3. It's the single longest scene in the entire play at 243 lines. And in modern performance, it can actually be quite boring because we don't understand what's going on in this scene. First of all, there's no Macbeth. It's set in England. Malcolm and Macduff are in exile at the court of King Edward the Confessor. Malcolm tests Macduff for loyalty to see if he can trust him, and Macduff is told of the deaths of his family. What's going on? This is all conversation. Nothing happens. It's very unusual in this play for the long scene to be the one where there's no action. There's no real plot development. But what's actually going on here is politics, and military politics at that. Malcolm is at the English court asking to be given an army to help him invade Scotland, and Macduff has links with the Scots nobles who wants to rebel against Macbeth. What you have is every Renaissance ruler's worst nightmare. You have local insurgents ready to rise up in support of an invading army. Now this matters because we're talking about the English Renaissance. In 1588, only 18 years before this play is first performed, you had the Spanish Armada, where exactly this was about to happen to England. The Spanish invasion force, everybody thought, would be met by a rising of English Catholic rebels. That's central to the resonances, the contemporary political resonances of the play. Now, I'm not going to look at Act 5 in a lot of detail because so much happens at great speed. There are 9 scenes and the longest is 79 lines. So you have this long scene at the end of Act 4 that brings the plot together, and then you have the movement towards Macbeth's demise, destruction. Act 5, Scene 1, Lady Macbeth sleepwalking scene. Then we cut to the Scots Lords in Rebellion, cut back again to Macbeth at Dunsinane, patterning with King Duncan earlier in the play, except this is a king who will fight, and he's told that his wife is ill. Cut scene to the armies combining, the rebels and the invaders combining at Birnam Wood, where they cut down the trees to disguise their numbers, fulfilling one of the prophecies. Cut back again to Macbeth getting ready for battle at Dunsinane, and he's told that his wife has died off stage again, and he doesn't seem to worry about this. He's already moved on. Events are in movement. He's going to have to stay the course. He says, I'll worry about that later. Another cut scene to the invading armies where they throw down their leafy screens and their full numbers are shown. The whole army emerges, and then you move to the battle. This is all happening very quickly. Young Siward is killed in personal combat by Macbeth. He's the son of the general of the invading English army. Macbeth has killed him and then stormed off stage to go and do more killing because he's very good at it. Macduff comes in, finds the body, swears more revenge. Then you get the emblematic fight, such an important moment where Macduff kills Macbeth. All sorts of quotations you can use in there. Then you move to the end of the entire play, which is only 41 lines. This final scene, tiny. The victors are in discussion. They talk about the death of young Siward in battle. His father doesn't seem too bothered by this. He says, where are his wounds? They're all to the front. Then he died like a man. Fine. Thanks, Dad. Then Macduff enters with Macbeth's head to present to everybody, and they talk about going off to crown Malcolm. And it just stops. So the momentum of the play is relentless until you get to Act 4, Scene 3, which brings everything together, and then you get a very swift movement of events towards the end and the death of Macbeth at the end of Act 5. Right, now that we've looked at the play as a whole, we're going to have a think about study tips. This isn't necessarily for assessments, it's also if you're interested in the play in and of itself, because you either want to go and see it or you want to read it, whatever. The element that we've looked at so far, the kind of stats that I've given you, are actually quite boring. But I've done the work, so you don't need to worry about it. They tell you a lot about how a play is constructed. Structure supports plot, and in turn, how the speed of a play varies at different points. Now, Macbeth's acts are relatively evenly balanced, which means they're very smooth as a whole. Of course, there's quite a lot of variation within them. The scene lengths vary widely, with the average being 72 lines. There's a couple of 10 lines and one very long scene. There are some medium length ones which are subdivided into different bits, but basically the action in Macbeth moves quite quickly from scene to scene, apart from that one in London or perhaps Winchester, certainly in England when Malcolm and Macduff are discussing strategy. That means that plot elements in this play come at you relatively quickly. It's quite a relentless play in terms of its pace. Now, what we'll also look at, if you want to think about the actual characters, is first of all, we'll start with Macbeth, obviously as the main point of view character. Now, on the screen, I've given you a list of all the scenes that he's present in the play, which is almost every single one. Not quite, but not far off it. When you're looking at a main character, especially from the point of view of writing about him, look out for idiosyncratic little tics, little character tricks. In the case of Macbeth, in this play, it's famous for it, is his use of soliloquies and to some extent asides. If you can use these technical terms, it means that you understand some of the conventions of Renaissance drama and you're reminding your examiner that this is a play and you understand what's going on. Hopefully that will get you some more points. Look at the main scenes where he advances the plot, think about them, and think about the way he uses discourses of masculinity. Highlight the scenes you need, and within that, highlight the sections of text you want to pay attention to. Even if you don't quote them, say in an exam, at least you can refer to them. Next person to think about, obviously, is Lady Macbeth, main secondary character. She's relatively easy to visualise if you think it, again, say in filmic terms. She's similar to Macbeth. She uses soliloquies as well. She also uses a gender language. She attempts to defy her own femininity, deny her own femininity, and she goads Macbeth's manhood to make him murder Duncan. There is another issue with Lady Macbeth, which is that she's removed from the plot when she no longer seems necessary. And you might want to think about that. But basically, she's entirely absent from Act 4. She then has the sleepwalking scene at the beginning of Act 5, and then she's just killed off stage. So that's something to do with the way she relates to the plot. That's worth thinking about. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Weird Sisters, the witches, how they function in the plot. Watch for the language they use. It stands out from everyone else. That reinforces the fact that they are separate from the other characters. Get a little detail like that into an exam answer or an essay. They use a different poetry from everyone else. Highlight where they appear. Within that, highlight the scenes or the parts of the scenes, the acts, the speeches, the little tiny details that you can use in an answer. Now, first of all, can't reinforce this often enough, they begin the play. They set the world up. It's their world that Macbeth inhabits. He doesn't act in and of himself, he acts in a world they've defined. They then meet Macbeth and Banquo, a couple of scenes later, after they're returning from the battlefield, and they speak the first set of prophecies. They're pretty much absent from the play until the beginning of the fourth act, when Macbeth visits them, and they give him the second set of prophecies, including the one about Banquo being the ancestor of the Stuart kings, which really annoys him. They're not in the play very much. You think about it, really it's only 3 scenes. There is another possibility with Act 3, Scene 5, which may have been added by Middleton, probably was, collaborator of Shakespeare. But really, they're the ones who set the thing up and they're not in it very much. That is worth thinking about. The other characters, we'll look at King Duncan and his elder son Malcolm. Duncan isn't in the play for very long because he's killed off very quickly. He's the king that Macbeth murders. You see this on the screen. He really only appears in 3 scenes and he's killed off stage. We'll come back to that. We've mentioned it before, but we will keep coming back to it. It's an important technique. Malcolm is a bit of a cipher. He's there, you know who he is, but he doesn't actually do very much. Until that really important scene at the end of Act 4 when he's plotting with Macduff in exile in England. So watch the way that Malcolm and Duncan relate to the plot. Malcolm starts to take over because his father's been killed, but it takes a while for him to come to the fore. Macduff is even more of this kind of developmental character, the way he relates to the plot, than Malcolm, because he's around the place, you recognise who he is, or at least you should if, you know, the performance is working quite well. But he really only starts to become important when he's in exile in England with Malcolm, and then you then move towards the end of the play, especially with the discovery that he was not of woman born and he kills Macbeth. Both of those characters, Malcolm and Macduff, are late developers. Now, Shakespeare's audiences seemed to have no problem with that. It can be quite difficult for modern audiences, but changing characterisation is not an issue for Renaissance drama. I've also given you a slide on Banquo, who for a very minor character, actually, well, some of the time he's dead. He appears in the play quite a lot. The reason is, it's not quite a subplot, but it's a sub-level, a subtext, more than subtext, sometimes it's quite obvious. He is the ancestor of the guy who's on the throne in London when Macbeth is being performed, right? He's the ancestor of the Stuart King James VI of Scotland, first of England and Scotland, of Great Britain. I keep saying that, but it's so important. This brings up another issue with the play's context, which is the porter scene, the very beginning of Act 2, Scene 3. Now, again, I've put this on the screen. You might think, why am I bothering? It's quite a short scene, it's not that important, it's emblematic, it doesn't advance the plot, but it's a favourite of examiners, and a lot of people were caught out a few years ago when it came up in GCSE and nobody had studied it. Now, a sensible thing to do if you're studying for an exam in particular is have a backup. And the Porter scene matters because it's a drunken Scot at the gates of hell, but it's also the equivocation, the possible reference to the language used by Jesuit Father Garnet on trial for the Gunpowder Plot, 1605. Right? The play has a very specific set of contemporary resonances, very, very precise political resonances, and that's what's happening in the Porter scene. Keep that in mind just in case it comes up. So finally, we'll look at some keywords. I'll run through these quickly. It's an ed memoir for you. It should be quite useful. First of all, structure. That's the underlying skeleton that supports the plot. The plot needs a good skeleton. You have to have structure to have plot. Otherwise, there's no plot. You lose the plot. Exposition, introduction of major plot elements. In this play, watch for the importance of offstage representation. Important events happen offstage, they're not shown, right? And there are several of them. What does that mean? In practice, what it means is the audience obviously doesn't see them directly, so your attention is diverted to what the characters think about it. What is the importance to these individual characters on the stage of these events? Examples: King Duncan's murder happens off stage. Coronation of Macbeth, mentioned, happens off stage. Death of Lady Macbeth happens off stage. Why? Well, first of all, it lets the playwright vary the terms. It's a different set of techniques. Also, this is a very economical play. It's a quick play. Things happen in succession. This means that you're focusing in on the action. You're not having your attention drawn to spectacle. There is one other possibility, especially with the death of King Duncan, which is that Shakespeare is not allowed to represent it directly. If you think about it, on that stage, showing the death of a king is pretty serious stuff. Technically, it was illegal. That also may be why Macbeth is crowned off stage, because to show it might give it some legitimacy. Right, so think about these things. These are performance techniques. So too is the aside, performance technique, spoken by a character directly to the audience, the convention being the other characters don't hear them. Macbeth uses it a lot. The soliloquy is like a super aside. It's a full speech delivered directly to the audience by a single character on stage on their own, saying, this is what I'm going to do, this is what's happening, this is what I'm up to. Are you with me or aren't you? Basically, it's getting the audience involved. Something we picked up on earlier, rhyming couplets. This is a really strange thing to say to a modern audience, because we don't think like this, but Shakespeare's audience did. They were very good at hearing words. Oral culture, A-U-R-A-L. When a scene ends with a rhyming couplet, it stands out. Normally blank verse doesn't rhyme, but this is almost like the theme tune to a soap opera. So when Macbeth is going off to murder King Duncan in his sleep off stage, you get the doof doof, like the end of EastEnders or whatever. It's exactly the same technique. Or when he wants to have Banquo killed. So it's a little signal to the audience that this scene is finishing and the next one is coming up. Other things we've mentioned in this play, again you see these on the screen, the emblematic moments, the parts of the play that don't advance the plot but are symbolic to the plot or comment on the plot. Those are quite useful. Remember the Porter scene in that regard. Equivocation, again remember the Porter scene. But also remember the witches. They're always balancing impossibilities, impossible things. Their language is saturated with it. How do you possibly tell the truth? That has a very contemporary resonance for Shakespeare's audience. And of course, to finish off, that brings us to the prophecies, their extreme centrality. All of these are major plot elements, or the way that they're put into practice on performance on that stage. So good luck if you're studying the play. And if you want to know more, there are also videos on characterisation and context for Macbeth, so please remember to subscribe.